Steve, the war in Ukraine now entering its second year. What do you think we're likely to see in the year ahead? Do you think we are closer to an escalation of the conflict or de-escalation?
Probably neither. It's likely in the second year to be much more of the same. Perhaps the Ukrainians take a town, a village here. Perhaps the Russians take one there. More of the back and forth. And according to the military analysts and government officials I've been speaking with, they expect really a stalemate that will continue for the unforeseeable future.
We saw President Biden travel to the region, go to Kiev, and then in Poland, he made a big speech where he reaffirmed his support for the Ukrainians. But does he have the same kind of unwavering support for this in Congress, both inside his own party and amongst Republicans? Now, I know some Republicans are for more support for Ukraine, some are not.
So far, yes, he does. However, there are fractures in the Republican Party. There is a big push among a substantial number of lawmakers in the Republican Party to really cut back on the federal budget. Military expenditures and aid to Ukraine will come into question. Some of the lawmakers are saying, look, we have problems to take care of here at home. Why are we spending so many billions and billions of dollars in Ukraine? So as the year goes on, that is certainly to become more of an issue, especially as we get closer to a presidential election next year here in the United States. And you're going to see candidates emerging and taking positions, especially to try to go after Joe Biden, even if they're just Republican primary candidates.
How does Joe Biden then navigate this? Or is this really a problem for the Republicans, their disagreement on whether or not to increase or keep the support for Ukraine at the same levels?
Well, it's probably more a problem for the Democrats because they control the Senate and they control the executive branch of government. And they do have to fight with some of the Republicans in the House over the budget. But as Joe Biden, presumably, who will be running for re-election, gets closer and closer to being a political candidate again, he's going to come under more scrutiny about the spending for Ukraine. It's much easier to be a statesman than it is to be a political candidate when you're especially talking about foreign geopolitics.
Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said before that his country is essentially not just fighting Russia, but also war fatigue, especially among some Western nations. Do you get a sense from the reporting that you've done and the people you've spoken to that there is war fatigue among some nations who are part of the Western alliance?
I think perhaps at this point, it's not necessarily fatigue, but some nervousness about how long is this going to go on? Can we maintain this momentum? That is really the key for the Western alliance, including NATO and members of the European Union, is when there become more problems domestically, there is going to be more called into question about all this spending and the risks to global peace, the more that this war goes on. And because there is no end in sight, we can expect those questions to be raised.
And speaking of no end in sight and war fatigue, how does Vladimir Putin keep his allies engaged and interested in this for the long haul? I mean, what does he tell them?
Yes, I don't think the danger is so much for the allies, especially China or Iran, Belarus, the allies of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. They don't have so much at stake in all of this. It's more a question, perhaps, of what happens inside Russia the longer this goes on, because the Russians are suffering a significant number of casualties on the front lines. And until now, they've been able to use some gullible young people, perhaps, and the Wagner Group, conscript prisoners, as basically cannon fodder. But that cannot continue indefinitely. So that's probably the biggest concern for Putin as he looks at this war going into a second year.
Steve, do you think there is any possibility that Vladimir Putin could somehow be forced to the negotiation table on this? Is there any world in which this can happen, and what would it take?
Certainly, there are a number of different scenarios where that could happen. Are they very likely? They don't seem like it from our perspective here, but this is a war. There are a lot of things that can happen that are not predictable that could force Putin to the negotiating table, but there are no signs that we're seeing overtly of that occurring in the near future.
Well, Steve, we're going to keep an eye on this. Thank you so much for always coming in and talking to us.
My pleasure, yes.